I've been organising public events talking about autism spectrum conditions for quite a long time now, and this time I'm actually presenting work myself. So the background is, as Glenn alluded to, I've spent the last year working on a fellowship that was granted to me by the British Academy to focus on a research project investigating autism spectrum conditions in adulthood. And so I planned this talk way back at the start of that project as a kind of end point at which point I could talk about the findings and talk about the project and share with people the outputs and the research findings that have come out. So that's what today's talk's going to be. Bear in mind that I actually only really finished collecting data for the project a few weeks ago, and so what I'm going to present to you today is really just a tip of an iceberg. There'll be more analysis to come and more data to come, but this is a kind of summary of the aims of the project and the findings that we have so far. The other thing to bear in mind is that the work hasn't yet been peer-reviewed, and by peer review I mean scrutinised by experts in the field. That will come at some point, of course, but just bear in mind that these results are very much hot off the press. But what I'm presenting you today is results that I've analysed quite carefully, so I'm confident that they're correct. But there's some other stuff that I'm still working on that I didn't want to present because it's not quite finished. But I'll keep you all informed and send outputs and various updates when more findings come. So the aim of the project and the reason why I wanted to work on this project was because I've been doing autism research for quite a long time, and typically I started off researching with children. I think when you think about autism, it's often easier to think you think about autistic children. You actually don't often think about autism in adulthood. And it was quite clear that actually there's almost what you might think about as a lost generation. So many adults who have autism are autistic adults, but people don't really, there's very much less research about this population, and there's much less known about autism in adulthood. And also a very interesting area is adults who actually don't receive a diagnosis until they're in their adulthood. So they have their whole lifetime go through school and through part of adulthood before they actually get a diagnosis. And that, I think, is a very interesting area and something that there's very little research on in terms of that particular set of people. So this is the research that I've focused on. And the aim really was both to understand autism in adulthood, but also to disseminate the information and to share what I'm finding and kind of broadcast that and raise awareness and share information really. So in addition to doing the research, there have been a few public events. I've made a small film which is available on YouTube, and we've had some other lectures and also a public forum event where people have talked about their experience of being diagnosed as an adult. And so I've tried to disseminate this information far and wide, and I'm really happy to discuss with anybody at the end of the talk if there are any other ideas and things for dissemination. And the other thing that I think it's important to say is that I hope I've done the participants of the research justice, because I've really had an absolute privilege over the last year to meet many people who've taken the time to come and spend a few hours with me talking quite openly and frankly about their experiences, and that has been a real privilege, and I kind of see it as my role to be able to condense that information and share it with a wider audience as possible. So I hope at the end of the talk you feel as though I've distilled that information and represented people appropriately. So I want to kind of think about numbers now. I'm very, very number driven and data driven, and I like to be able to think of things in terms of numbers. But actually one of the things the project has taught me is that sometimes you can miss the wider picture if you're just focusing on the numbers. So I'm trying to have a more balanced perspective. But in terms of thinking about diagnosis in adulthood, there was a survey done in the States which identified that 80% of people identified as having an autism spectrum condition in California were under the age of 18. So you might think, well, that represents some kind of epidemic of autism in children, and it's mainly children who have autism and not adults. But actually a very nice study that was done in the UK a few years ago, which took a screening approach. So basically what this study did was select a region in the southeast and send out information, research packets to just random postcodes with a set of questionnaires which screened for traits of autism. And people returned the information, and then if people returned the information and reached a certain cut-off, then the researchers contacted them and did more face-to-face in-depth interviewing. And basically they found that with this random selection, about 1% of the individuals living in this area, just a random selection of people in the southeast, met the diagnostic criteria for autism despite not having a diagnosis. So that tells us two things. One, the 1% figure is about the same as the epidemiological estimate in children, so it suggests that actually this idea of there being a kind of epidemic of autism, as it were, isn't the case. It's not the case that we didn't have autism 40 or 50 years ago. It's much more the case that it just hasn't been identified. And the other thing it tells us that there's quite likely a whole number of people who would meet diagnostic criteria for autism but don't have an actual diagnosis. And it kind of begs the question, well, why would you think of getting a diagnosis? You've gone through your whole life without a diagnosis. What's the value? It's not as though autism can be cured or changed, so why attach a medical label to it? And opinions vary on that respect. And so I think some people find it actually very helpful because it enables them to put some kind of understanding on their own experiences and difficulties that they might have experienced in the past. And more awareness, and also access to some services, and also can help with developing acceptance, and that's a theme that I'm going to talk about later in the talk as well. But it's also really important to consider it's actually a personal choice, that some people might find a diagnosis useful, other people not so, and actually are not interested in the idea of attaching a label or a medical term to their personality type. So again, another theme that I hope comes across through the talk is that it's always really important to bear in mind multiple perspectives, and I hope I don't present something which looks as though I'm saying this is what autism is, this is what autism isn't, because it really can vary for different people in different circumstances and different environments. But there are some commonalities and themes which I'll draw out. So as an overview of today's talk, I'm going to vaguely split it into two parts. So firstly, we'll talk about the characteristics of autism spectrum conditions in adulthood, specifically in terms of co-occurring conditions, sensory issues, camouflage of symptoms, satisfaction with life, and I'll consider this question of autism spectrum being a continuum in the population. And then secondly, I'm going to address aspects to do with the biological basis of autism. And consider what is divergent in the term neurodivergence. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term neurodivergence, but for anybody who isn't, it's a term coined by the autistic community to describe the fact that autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, but not necessarily a disorder. So the actual diagnostic term that the medical manuals use when talking about autism is autism spectrum disorder. But a lot of people prefer not to use the term disorder because of its kind of negative and pejorative consequences. So instead, this idea of difference or divergence is much more popular. So the design of the experiment or the protocol or the research was that people came in to see me for 2 or 3 hours at a time, and we completed lots of questionnaires together. I was interested in measuring the common traits of the autism spectrum, plus other co-occurring things such as anxiety, satisfaction with life. I was interested in measuring sensory sensitivities, and we also had a nice chat. And as I said earlier, I was really touched by the extent to which people kind of opened up and were willing to share their experiences with me. And then people also had an EEG recording whereby we can measure neural activity by way of small sensors that we place on the scalp. And so that gives us insight into neurodivergence as well. And there were roughly, think of it as terms of 2 studies. So the first study involved 60 neurotypical adults, so people without any diagnosis of an autism spectrum condition. And then the second study involved 29 adults who did have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum condition. And just as a description, this is really just for the scientific perspective, just to show that when I'm making comparisons between the groups, And as so far as I could, I made sure that the group, the autistic adults and the neurotypical adults were similar in terms of age and gender and other factors which I haven't put up on the screen, like cognitive ability. So this isn't all that relevant. Otherwise, just to show that you can see the age of diagnosis. So in that second row, the average age of diagnosis for the autistic adults in the sample was 39. And in this column here, you can see the range. So it ranged from 8 to 64. So 2 or 3 of the participants had been diagnosed as in childhood, but the vast majority didn't receive their diagnosis till they were much older, and the oldest being 64. And this row here shows the length of time since diagnosis, and the average length of time was 6 years, and that ranged from 0, so people were involved in the research after only recently having had a diagnosis, up to 21 years. So this kind of gives you a sense of the sample of participants that I was working with. In terms of the specific diagnosis, as you probably know, before the introduction of the latest edition of the DSM, the diagnostic manual, people could be given a diagnosis of autism or Asperger's. Nowadays, those diagnoses aren't typically given, and it's just a kind of umbrella diagnosis of ASD. But many of these people had received a diagnosis before the change in the manual, so you can see that 21 had a diagnosis of Asperger's, 7 were diagnosed with autism, and 1 had a diagnosis of high functioning or atypical autism. So thinking about the characteristics, the first thing that I want to point out is that co-occurring diagnoses are not uncommon in autism. So depression and anxiety was the participants, in the autistic participants, 50% of them, or just under 50%, also had a diagnosis of depression and or anxiety. ADHD diagnoses were also more frequent than would be expected in the typical population, and as were dyslexia. And there were also additional diagnoses of ME and chronic fatigue and dyspraxia. The other important thing, and it's highlighted in red here, that there's significant variability in that. So when I'm talking about 50% of the participants had co-occurring diagnoses of depression and anxiety, it means 50%. There was also 50% of the participants who didn't have that. And so, as I was saying earlier, it's important to remember that we're talking about a kind of varied spectrum. But nevertheless, these co-occurring conditions did appear much more frequently than would be expected by chance. But I looked at some of these things in much more detail. So one of the things I measured was anxiety. And to do this, I used something called the Beck Anxiety Inventory, specifically the trait version. So that means I was interested in kind of more generalized anxiety rather than the specific anxiety associated with coming to the testing session and working with me, meeting a new person. This questionnaire involves 21 different items. They represent physical sensations associated with anxiety, and participants rate whether they experience them rarely or never, occasionally, often, or almost always. So the maximum score you could get is 63. And you can present the data in 2 ways. So you can think of it as a continuous variable with a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 63. Or you can also specify or categorize people based on their scores into 4 groups, reflecting low, mild, moderate, or severe anxiety. So when you do that, you can see that in the grey bars are the data from the neurotypical population, showing that the vast majority of them have either low or mild reports of anxiety using that questionnaire. But the orange or red bars represent data from the autistic adults, showing that there's a much higher proportion of anxiety. Now that co-occurs with existing data, especially it seems to be the case that the participants with what's called higher functioning autism. I don't really like that term because it's kind of relative, but I think what it means in this context is autistic people who don't have a co-occurring intellectual difficulties. So in that population, which is this kind of sample that I've been working with, that actually anxiety levels are very high. It might not sound surprising because I just said previously that about half the group already had an existing diagnosis of depression or anxiety. But even when you take those participants out of the analysis, so what I'm showing you now is data from autistic people who don't have a co-occurring diagnosis of anxiety, but yet despite that, they're still showing very high levels. So about 50% of the people, even though they don't have any existing diagnosis of anxiety, are showing, about 50% of this sample are showing moderate or severe levels of anxiety. So one of the really striking things was the importance of anxiety, or the fact that anxiety is a very prevalent and salient feature in the autism spectrum profile, especially in this type of characteristic. And I think that's important to be aware of for many reasons, really, but especially from a clinical perspective, that anxiety is a severe feature, or can be, for people. Another element that was interesting, it was sensory sensitivity. So there are many really insightful anecdotal examples of sensory sensitivity in autism. And that can range from feeling overwhelmed by the sensory environment, finding specific difficulties with processing certain types of stimuli, being very sensitive to sound or very sensitive to certain types of visual information, and having very overly sensitive sense of smell. So there's lots of examples. It's actually quite difficult to measure, and I used this questionnaire called the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire because it was developed, well, not because, but the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire was developed by a colleague of mine, and I used it because it was one way in which I could try and quantify the sensory experiences of autism. And the example questions are things like, do bright lights ever hurt your eyes or cause a headache? Do you find it difficult to go into a strong smelling shop, for example Lush or the Body Shop? And people rate their responses either never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always. And again, this is the data here showing the autistic participants had a much higher score on this questionnaire, which concurs with anecdotal reports of increased sensory sensitivity. So that's the data from the autistic group compared with the data from the neurotypical group. Now, where possible, for the most part, I've put statistical tests on these slides to show you when something is statistically different between the two groups. I'm not going to dwell on that or go into it because I don't think it's really very interesting for people. But what I am going to do, because it is important from the perspective of empirical research and actually knowing that the findings that we're reporting are robust and not just things that might happen by chance. So what I'm going to do after the talk, I'll upload my slides, also upload the video of the talk, and I'm going to write a little, well, I've already written it, but a little kind of like statistic explanation so that people who are interested in that but aren't necessarily educated in statistics can try and follow it and actually understand when I'm talking about a significant difference between the groups. So this is sensory sensitivity, and this is a kind of flavour of the type of experiences that were reported. So in this column, I'm showing you for the autistic sample and the neurotypical, the percentage of people who reported often or always for these different elements. And you can see again there's a range. So the most frequently endorsed item was that certain noises and pitches of sound are annoying. And also there was quite a strong response to the idea that bright lights hurt people's eyes and can cause a headache. Now, one thing that this questionnaire doesn't measure, I think, well, it definitely doesn't measure, is that in addition to responding to the questionnaire, as we were going through these items, people would say, you know, but yes, and when that happens, then if I'm overstimulated, then the next day I'm completely exhausted and I have to kind of take some time out. And I think in some respects, using questionnaires like this, and I think this theme will crop up later on, it measures only really the tip of the iceberg, and although it is useful to be able to quantify these things, there's a whole context and set of other information that's not necessarily picked up by the questionnaires. So I'm going to try and feed in those kind of insights whenever I can through the talk. It's more difficult to do because it becomes quite subjective, and I don't want this to be, this is my opinion about this situation. I want, wherever possible, to make it very empirical and data-driven. But like I said before, I think sometimes it's important to have a balance of those two things. Also, while people were discussing this, it became clear that there are quite a lot of costs to sensory sensitivity, and that people really were challenged by it. But also in some cases some benefits. So focusing on the cost first, people highlighted that sensory sensitivity actually can have a very dramatic impact on people's lives to the extent that they will avoid going to certain situations. And I know that there are people who would have liked to come to the talk today but don't want to come to this building because of the lighting. So that's obviously an example of that, people's behaviour being changed because of sensory sensitivities. People also reported it being exhausting, overwhelming, leading to anxiety, frustrating, unpleasant and distracting. Though people also did highlight that there were some benefits. So people talked about actually in certain circumstances, whether it could be a vocation or a hobby, it can be beneficial to having sensory sensitivities. And some people also talked about kind of providing a richer appreciation of the environment, specifically a kind of appreciation of art, for example, or just the kind of perceiving the world around them. But overall, I think there's a general feeling that the sensory sensitivities can be really challenging. And another thing that's tricky about them is that if you don't experience them, it's basically impossible to understand what it might be like for somebody who does. And it reminds me of, I don't do this anymore, but when I was a kid, I used to be obsessed with thinking about, well, how do I know that the colour I see is red is the same as what my dad sees as the colour red? And of course, you can never know. And so it's the same with sensory sensitivities. No one can know how somebody else perceives the world. And I think that can also be very challenging because it kind of it's a hidden problem which is difficult to discuss and share with people, but yet it can lead to behavioural changes and other elements that is otherwise quite difficult for people to understand. So I think being aware of that and raising awareness of that amongst everybody is really important. Another thing that was quite salient in the data was this idea of camouflage. And I think especially with this population who have, in the most part, gone through years of their life without any kind of diagnosis and almost had to hide their traits to fit in with a society that is otherwise not really very welcoming often. And this is a kind of newish idea in research, I think, but I wasn't necessarily planning to look at this from the outset, but it kind of emerged through the discussions that I had, and it was obviously something that was interesting to look at. And so one of the questionnaires that I use is called the RADS, the Ritvo Adult Autism Diagnostic Scale, and it has 80 items that people respond to and say whether they endorse particular types of traits or experiences or behaviour that are associated with the autism phenotype. 3 of those items relate to this nature of camouflage, so the idea that people have to pretend to be somebody else to fit in. And these 3 questions were, I like to copy the way certain people speak and act because it helps me appear more normal. I have to act normal to please other people and make them like me, and I get along with other people by following a set of specific rules that help me to look normal. And so in order to try and measure this camouflage nature, I took these questions specifically. You could score from 0 to 3 on this questionnaire. So if someone's endorsing these items really strongly, they'll get a score of 9. If they're not endorsing them at all, they'll have a score of 0. And this is the data. So this is data from autistic adults. So some autistic adults didn't endorse those items at all. They didn't feel that they were camouflaging their symptoms, but quite a lot did. So I've classed at this end, if you're scoring 7, 8 or 9, I'm considering that as a severe or a kind of strong example of the camouflaging because people are endorsing those items. And so just under half of the autistic group showed that degree of camouflaging. But then again, the nature of the instrument was that we would talk about the issues, and what was really interesting was the fact that actually some people felt like they'd kind of gone beyond that and come to a place of more acceptance. For example, in response to I have to act normal to please other people and make them like me, the type of things that people might say in response to that is, well, not anymore, I used to do that, but it was really exhausting and it didn't work. Or my diagnosis was the permission I needed to stop adjusting my behaviour to please other people. Or now that I know I have Asperger's, it's easier just to be me. Now, I have to highlight, I've put these in quotation marks because to give the flavour of what I'm saying, but they're not direct quotes because I wasn't actually transcribing the sessions, but it's things that I'm kind of trying to encapsulate what people were saying to me as we were having these discussions. And this is going to crop up again when I'm talking about the neurotypical sample. Now the next thing that I want to talk to you about is life satisfaction. So one of the aims of the work was to try and identify what are the things that can be done to help people with autism feel more welcome in the environment, and what distinguishes autistic people who are kind of flourishing and doing really well from autistic people who are struggling and not doing so well. That's obviously quite a bit of an ambitiously large goal, but some kind of ideas emerge which I want to share with you. Another thing it's important to say is that these things can be very transient. So I heard a lot from people who were saying, well, at this point in time I'm in this place in my life, which is quite a good place in my life, but then 2 or 3 years ago things were much different, and I wouldn't have been able to come in and take part in this research because I just wasn't in a position where that could have been on my agenda. So not only is there a lot of variability between different people, there's also a lot of variability within people across time, and in many ways that's quite a good message, I think, or it's something that was quite positive for me to see, that there can be change and variation, and people who in the past might have found things very, very difficult and challenging can ultimately sometimes find ways to overcome that and find a better place. So this is my way of trying to measure life satisfaction, and so it's just 5 items. It's a standardized questionnaire that measures how kind of satisfied somebody is with their life. It's supposed to distinguish between affect, so it's not measuring if somebody is broadly happy or unhappy, it's just whether so far with their life they're happy with the way it's turned out. And it's scored like this, and so a score of 7 would show that someone's really feeling very positive about their life, whereas a score of 1 would be someone's feeling very negative about their life. And this is the data. So there is a significant difference in that the autistic adults were reporting lower life satisfaction than the neurotypical adults. Now again, what I'm showing you is an average plot. It's the mean response. So what you don't see in this plot is that, again, there's a lot of variability. So some neurotypical adults rated their life satisfaction very low, and some autistic adults rated their life satisfaction very high. So on average, the life satisfaction was lower in the autistic sample, but that doesn't mean that all autistic people are not happy with their life. Far from it. That certainly wasn't the case. So there's a variety. But on average, the autistic sample life satisfaction was lower. But I was also interested in the way in which life satisfaction might relate to some of the other elements that I've measured. So could you maybe identify that there's certain traits or symptoms that are more related to life satisfaction than others? And so here what I'm reporting is what's called a correlation coefficient. So that's a statistical a statistical output which shows the extent to which 2 variables are related. So the correlation coefficient will always be somewhere between -1 and 1. And the closer to either -1 or 1, the more strongly the variables are related. So if it's a minus number, it means that the relationship is going in this direction as one variable increases, the other one decreases. If it's a positive number, it means the relationship is in that direction. As one variable increases, the other one increases too. And there's more analysis, more sophisticated analysis that I can do on this, and that I will do at some point to try and really pull these things apart. But just for now, I just wanted to kind of highlight that sensory sensitivity and also trait severity were significantly related to life satisfaction. And you might be thinking, well, okay, but the way you've measured this by doing questionnaires could be a bit biased, because it might be that people just have a tendency to rate themselves positively or some other people have a tendency to rate themselves more negatively. And that's completely a valid concern. And so in addition to asking the participants to complete questionnaires, I also asked them to nominate someone who knew them well, if possible, to complete a questionnaire about them, so that I would get an objective report. And so this is what is shown here. And also, even when somebody else is rating the severity or the extent to which individuals are showing autistic type traits and behaviours, that is still related to life satisfaction. And I looked at it in more detail by looking at the RADS questionnaire that I told you about a second ago. So within the RADS questionnaire, there are 4 subscales that you can pull out, which represent social relatedness, which is broadly defined as one's social network, or ability to kind of relate with others around them, and also to have the opportunities to relate with others around them. The other factor is circumscribed interests. The other one is sensory or motor issues, and then social anxiety. And of those 4 subscales, the only one that was a significant correlation with satisfaction with life was social relatedness, which suggests that when we think about the traits and the symptoms of autism, in terms of how they may impact on satisfaction with life, one's social network and ability to access social network is actually really important, and possibly more important than these other things. But as I said, there's more sophisticated analysis that I can do on this to really pull that finding out if it's there. So based on all that, thinking about what can actually help, and really what I feel, and this is a message that I want to try and share as much as possible, is that one thing that can really help is awareness and understanding. So that's from other people and also oneself. So I think a lot of people spoke about that with the onset, with the receipt of a diagnosis, and suddenly it opens a door to have more awareness and understanding about one's own condition, and acceptance, both from oneself to say, actually, you know, it's okay that I would rather spend time on my own than do something else. It's okay that I don't like going in the body shop because I have autism. It's fine. So that kind of acceptance, both to yourself and also from others, I think is really important. Also support, of course. Some people really varied in the extent to which they had support both from family or friend-based network, or within employment, or to try and find employment, and that people talked about that having a really positive impact on their kind of overall satisfaction. And it's really important as well to think about an individual approach. So just different people have different needs and challenges, and so recognising that and that not everybody's the same is also really important. Having the ability to make adjustments, and also other people making adjustments. So as an example, if I am sharing my office with an autistic co-worker, it would be sensible that I wouldn't wear perfume when I go to work, because my autistic co-worker probably, or may, really not like the strong perfume smells. Hello. And so it's a small adjustment for me, but it can actually have a really big and positive impact on other people. And just to kind of highlight that, I want to bring this to your attention. This is the Autism Hour from the National Autistic Society. Some of you are probably aware of this already. And this is the idea that the National Autistic Society is trying to promote on the 2nd of October, that shops and businesses should try and make their environments more autism friendly. So doing things like reducing potential for sensory overload, etc. And I think at the university we're hoping to be able to do something for this, and I think it's a bit gimmicky. I appreciate it is a little bit gimmicky, but in terms of raising awareness and kind of spreading the message about the impact that sensory sensitivity can actually have, and that it's really not always big adjustments that can make a big difference. And then another thing is finding the right environment. And now I would just want to share with you a brief excerpt from the video that I mentioned. This is Grace talking about how she felt when she received her diagnosis and the impact of being able to find the right environment for her has had.
Being diagnosed autistic was one of the most positive things in my life, because I dumped all mainstream society and started joining in disability, diversity friendly places. The way we treat each other, it's all about looking after each other, personal development, being kind to each other, helping each other. And when we look at some of the ways people treat each other in mainstream society, it's just quite nasty and barbaric compared to the way disabled people in the places I go treat each other.
So I think that kind of nicely rounds off this section of the talk, and the video, it's available on YouTube, and I would recommend having a look at it if you've got a chance. It was really insightful, and hopefully we'll share with you some of the insights that I learned when I was carrying out this research that was difficult to put into charts or graphs or questionnaires. But the main message, I think, is in terms of recognising that autism isn't something that should be kind of eradicated or isn't something that people should try and hide or get rid of. It is what it is, and life can be much easier in many respects for an autistic person if the environment and the society that they live in is aware of that and can make necessary adjustments to make people with autism fit more easily and feel more comfortable in that environment. So this element of the research now is going to talk about autistic traits in the general population. So I mentioned that I did some of the data collection with a sample of neurotypical people without any kind of diagnosis, and measured exactly the same elements that I measured in the autistic adults. So the same traits, symptom severity, anxiety, and other elements. And one of the things I was really interested in is this idea that autism occurs on a continuum in the general population. And the reason for that, I think, is data like this. You might have seen a data like this. This is data from the AQ, which is the Autism Spectrum Quotient, a questionnaire developed by Simon Baron-Cohen to measure autistic traits in the general population. And when you do that with a sufficiently large sample, what you often find is what this is called a normal distribution. So we've got AQ score along the bottom, and the number of individuals obtaining that score along the y-axis on the side. And it's called a normal distribution because it's kind of bell-shaped like that. And if you measure lots of things in biology, you see a bell-shaped distribution like this. You could measure height or weight, and it seems to be the same with autistic traits. And it's showing that some individuals over at the left side really don't identify with very many autistic traits at all, whereas some individuals on this side of the plot identify very strongly with autistic traits, whereas most people just kind of somewhere in the middle. And when you see data like this, it kind of makes you think that autism is a continuum, and that perhaps in this area, this grey shaded area, these are the individuals with a diagnosis. And I was interested in looking at that, and also when I start talking about the neural data as well, in terms of what we can learn from looking at the neural data with this. And I did find that within the neurotypical population, there was indeed something like this normal curve, in the sense that some people endorsed many of the behaviours and traits and experiences of the autism phenotype without any diagnosis, but they still identified strongly with that profile, whereas other people did much less so. And interestingly, the different elements that I measured were quite strongly related. So sensory symptoms were quite strongly related to anxiety, and also the kind of general severity was related with anxiety, and also the sensory symptoms. And they were also related to life satisfaction in the same way that these things were in the autistic group. So people who endorsed more of the autistic type traits also were rating themselves as more anxious and having more sensory issues, and in general reported lower life satisfaction. Now again, I'm just presenting correlations to kind of give you a flavour of the work, and before I submit this for publication, I'll do, like I said, more detailed and rigorous statistical tests to make sure that I really fully understand these relationships. But it just shows you that there is a kind of clustering and co-occurring of autistic traits within the general population. Now, quite what that means is difficult to ascertain, but I will talk a bit more about it at the end of the talk. And also the same criticism or question could be levied in terms of, well, perhaps you just get a general bias because it's the same people filling in the questionnaires. So this shows the way in which those items correlate with the questionnaire that's obtained from the objective person replying about the participant. And with the exception of anxiety, the strong correlations are maintained in the sense that even when somebody else is rating the extent to which somebody represents or endorses the autistic profile, they still correlate with sensory symptoms, severity as self-reported, and life satisfaction. Another thing that was interesting was this idea of camouflage within the neurotypical population. So the same variable that I mentioned before, I calculated for the neurotypical participants, and you can see that almost half of them didn't identify at all with the camouflage idea. Just under half of them scored 0 for the camouflage. But some of them, like the rest of them, to some greater or lesser degree, did endorse some kind of camouflage. And also, in terms of looking at correlation with anxiety and life satisfaction, there was a correlation there in the sense that the more camouflage someone was engaging in, the more anxious they were likely to rate themselves, and also the lower their overall life satisfaction. Now again, I have to be careful with how I present this message, because with a correlation you can't necessarily imply causality, so we don't know that any of these are causing each other. There could be some other variables that I haven't measured which are driving these things, but nevertheless, understanding that even within the neurotypical population you kind of see these patterns and relationships as well. I think it's important, important information to help us understand the kind of spectrum of autism as a whole. So a little interim summary. I'm mindful of the fact that I was worried I was going over time, and should just be about okay. So an interim summary is that we do see autistic traits varying in the neurotypical population. Some people identify with a lot, others with very few. And also co-occurring traits like anxiety and sensitivity also vary in the neurotypical population and correlate with the classic autistic traits. Now the next question that I was interested in is whether you also see a relationship with these things and the neurodivergence too. And this is what I'm going to talk about next. So for this final part of the talk, I'm going to talk about what is divergent in neurodivergence. And so the way in which I measured this in the study was to use EEG, which is electroencephalogram, and it's a way of measuring neural activity by placing small sensors on the scalp. That's me having the procedure. It's a really old photograph. And it takes about half an hour, and from this people sit and engage in whatever you ask them to do, if it's looking at something on a screen or just sitting quietly with their eyes closed, and we can measure neural activity, and from it we can infer an awful lot about both function and structure of the brain, specifically in terms of integrity of neural systems and the balance of certain types of neurotransmitters. And so one of the questions that I had was try and understand in what ways, if any, can we see that in autism these signals are different, and are these signals related to autistic traits in the general population. So just to explain this, I was going through my talk last night with my partner at home, and he really got lost in a lot of this, so I've tried to slim it down and make it really straightforward. So if there's anything you want more details about, then feel free just to ask me, but I've tried to hopefully make it as understandable as I can. So this is to show you a typical signal in response to being presented with a visual image. So it's at time point 0 that the visual image comes on, and you can see a very characteristic change to the EEG signal. There's a positive peak and a negative peak, and then a positive one at the end. And that's a very robust characteristic EEG signal related to visual information processing. And what I'm showing you there is it's looking face down at somebody's head, their nose is at the front, and the red is where the power of the activity is, and it's at the back of the head, which is what you would expect, because that's where the occipital cortex is, or the visual cortex, which is processing visual information. So this is a relatively straightforward EEG signal to measure reliably, and so this was one of the things that I measured from the participants. And so what I'm going to show you now is the neural response in the neurotypical sample and the neural response in the autistic sample. So if we just look here on the picture on the left and compare that with, this is the typical response, and so here we are, we're seeing that in both groups of participants, but there is a difference between the waveform of the autistic participants and the waveform of the neurotypical participants. You can see that those lines aren't fully overlapping and that they do differ, so the shape of the waveform is somewhat different. It's not grossly different, it's still showing the basic peaks and troughs as you would expect in both groups, but comparing the neurotypical to the autistic signal, that you do see differences, and quantifying that in a statistical way, because it's not really good enough to look at this plot and just say, oh yes, they're different, because you might expect to see random differences by chance, but to really know if it's a reliable effect or not, you need to be able to quantify it. So I've quantified it here just for, I've done lots of different things, but just to illustrate to you this main one. If you take the time when you see the peak, the first positive peak, you take the time of that, you calculate it for every person, and then you can make a plot like this. So this black line here is showing the average time. So for most people, it's between 100 and 110 milliseconds where you see that initial first burst of activity. And this shows the lowest and the highest and the average here. And you compare that with the average, or with the data for the autistic sample, and you can see that it's actually happening much more slowly. So in real terms, we're talking about a difference of about 10 milliseconds, which I know doesn't sound very much in terms of our understanding of time, but in terms of the speed in which the brain works, 10 milliseconds is actually quite a large difference. And so statistically, that's a significant difference. And if you calculate something called an effect size, the effect size is actually quite large in terms of comparing the difference between the time at which that signal peaks. Now, as I said before, it's not a gross difference, but it's a subtle difference, and it's helping us to kind of, one, recognise that there is evidence for neurodivergence, and that this is a neural difference that we see in autistic people, and that's different from the neurotypical people. And because scientists in general understand a lot about the EEG signal and how that relates to basic brain function and structure, we can use that information to infer what may be different in participants with autism. And one of the things that it suggests is differences in the balance of excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. But I think more relevant really for everybody here is the functional implications of that. And so actually, if you think about what it's saying, is that there's a kind of little delay or lag in the way in which the visual system is processing the visual information, which I think kind of ties into a lot of people's experience of sometimes reporting just needing a bit more time to process information and feeling that they can kind of easily feel bombarded or overwhelmed with information. And if we start to kind of be able to measure this in a neural way, then we can kind of understand this a lot more. So another thing I measured is how regular or stable this neural signal is over time. So when you present a stimulus, say here, at this point you see the characteristic change to the EEG, and then you see the same thing when you present it again, and the same thing when you present it again. Now, a highly regular, stable system would show exact synchronicity over the trials. A very irregular system would show kind of less synchronicity over the trials. And you can measure this, again, on a scale of 0 to 1. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how you measure it because it's very mathematically intensive, but in terms of just understanding that you can rate it from a scale of 0 to 1, with 1 being totally coherent and 0 being totally incoherent. This is data from a previous study that I did quite a few years ago with children, where I measured the regularity and the stability of the signal. So in this plot here, you can see that the red is the neurotypical group, and their regularity is quite close to 1. It's not exactly 1 because there is often random fluctuations in the brain, but it's still quite close to 1. And the signal from the autistic children is lower. It's about just over 0.7. And so again, that was a statistically significant difference, which is providing more evidence for neurodivergence and as well kind of helping us to unpick what that neurodivergence might actually be. So this is just showing how the regularity of the signal changes over time. So it's a slightly more complicated graph. This is the important one there, or the one that's easier to understand, that the regularity was lower in the autistic children. So one of the questions I had with this research was, would I find the same thing with the adult sample that I've worked with? And the answer was yes. Again, it's very subtle, so this is the waveform over time, and it looks broadly similar. The two groups do look broadly similar, so we're not talking about large, like catastrophic differences. We're talking about very subtle differences, or I think neurodivergence is really the best term to describe this, because it's just a difference and a divergence. Again, if you actually do the statistics on these things, although they look quite similar in these bar plots, the effect size of the difference is again quite large. Showing that, again, it's more evidence for neurodivergence and also giving us more kind of information to help understand what that neurodivergence might be. And in terms of functional implications of a less regular neural response. So some people might term this as neural noise. The system's a bit more noisy and a bit less regular, and this could lead to kind of difficulty with filtering out information and sensory overload. So the work linking the EEG findings with the actual functional experiences in autism is still really at its infancy. There's a lot of work to do in that regard. But in terms of starting to interpret these neural findings and considering how that could impact on people's experience, we're kind of starting to make some steps there. Now, the second question that I was interested in was whether or not those neural differences are related to any type of autistic traits in the neurotypical population. Because you can see this plot here, we're looking at the range. So let's look at the top one, which is the time to see the peak, the latency to peak, which is ranging from about 100 milliseconds to 115 milliseconds in the neurotypical population. So there's variance there. So whether or not that variance, those individual differences were also related to the variance or the individual differences in the traits and that I measured. And I did that for the latency to peak and also for the index of regularity, where there's also variance, you can see. And there's absolutely no relationships whatsoever. So these numbers are very close to zero, meaning that there's no relationship between one and the other. So what's going on with one's EEG, the kind of natural individual variability in that, is not related to how people are reporting their experience in terms of autistic traits or sensory sensitivity. Those things are entirely unrelated. And at first I was actually a bit surprised because I thought that that might be the case. And other research, some of which that I've done actually and other people have done, have found more of a relationship. But this study actually is one of the more in-depth investigations of autistic traits. And I think in terms of this relationship, I've really analysed it left, right and centre. And in terms of there being no evidence for relationship, the findings are actually really quite clear. And so given that we do see statistically significant differences with quite large effects between those variables and the neurotypical group, that's really interesting and impacts on the question of autism being a continuum in the population. Because I was expecting that we might see a relationship between these EEG variables and the traits and symptoms of autism. And if you do see that, then it supports the argument that actually, yes, autism is a spectrum on the population and that some people, because of individual variations in their neural activity, also have individual variations in the autistic profile. But actually that's not the case. It seems to be that what's going on in terms of neurodivergence and autism is distinctly different to any kind of variability in these signals in the neurotypical group. And the other thing to point out is that with this type of research, there isn't such a thing as a kind of objective biomarker that can be used to differentiate between this is what the brain of a participant with autism does and this is what the brain of somebody without autism does. That doesn't exist. And researchers for a long, long time have been trying to find such a thing. But in any paper you read, there's always data a bit like this, which you can see a difference. But in terms of, there's a lot of overlap. So you can see this is the individual, or here are some outline data points from autistic people who are quite low with the phase coherence, but others are actually quite high with the phase coherence and it's indistinguishable to somebody in a neurotypical group. But yet, here you can have people who may have very low phase coherence, but actually have quite regular looking latencies on the EEG. So there's really a mixture. And I know it sounds like a confusing message, but what I'm trying to say is that what this data shows is that there are potentially multiple neural differences in autism. So not a single description of neurodivergence, but multiple routes that can lead to the symptoms of autism rather than a single route. And I think as well that's an important message to kind of understand. And it leads me to think about this idea of potential subtypes. And this is data that isn't my data, this is from somebody else's work, whereby they measured or obtained descriptions of different types of traits and symptoms and entered the analysis into something called latent profile analysis to try and see if they could pull out different or identify whether there might be subclasses within the data. And basically they found, what this graph is showing, that there were 3 different subclasses that varied in terms of their profile of symptoms. So some people showed actually relatively, this is social communication, and this is kind of repetitive behaviour, restricted interest, and the higher up on the y-axis, the more severely this was rated. And so if you look at the green group, that group is showing a stronger difficulties in the repetitive behaviour element than the social communicative element. Whereas if you look at the red line, they're showing the opposite pattern. So the question is whether this type of behavioural classification could be related to neural differences. And I don't have the data yet from this talk to be able to give you a definitive answer on that, but that's something that I'm going to be working on and something that I think is potentially a much more useful idea going forward from a research point of view. Of course, from a functional and a clinical point of view, it's actually kind of irrelevant. Like, who cares if you've got phase coherence like this and P1 latency like that? That's not important. What's important to the individual and the clinician who is engaged with that individual is how their experiences are manifest and what's going on for their life at the time. So I don't want to overinflate the importance of this type of data, but from a scientific and a research point of view, understanding if there might be potential subtypes of autism is actually really important and could lead to quite a significant advance in the way in which research with autism is carried out. But that's a long way down the line, unfortunately. For that kind of research, you really need big collaborative projects with multiple sites and multiple people involved. So, as a general summary, before we go to the Q&A, I guess I've tried to condense a lot of information into the hour, and there was a lot more things that I wanted to be able to say, but didn't have the time, so maybe I'll do another talk one day. But I will be writing quite a lot about this work as well, so you'll be able to see that. But I guess the main take-home messages that I wanted to share was that autistic adults can and do face many challenges. And there are things that society can do to reduce the impact of these challenges. That was probably the message that's come across most strongly to me, not just from the research, but from the entire year of meeting different people and working in this area. And the second thing is that there are likely to be multiple routes to the traits of autism and also potential subclasses with the autism phenotype. And in terms of the implications of that work, I think that's quite important. And I think that's the end. So obviously I really cannot express my genuine thanks and gratitude for everybody who took part in the project and came to see me and really talked to me openly and engaged with me and told me stuff about their experiences, which really helped me learn an awful lot. And learning an awful lot is really saying it lightly. I feel totally humbled actually by the experience that I've had, and I hope I've been able to express that and do justice to the people who've been taking part. Also, Rosie, who's here, who helped me out a lot with the behind the scenes collecting the data, and I had a team of fabulous interns also who helped me with stuff. Dr. Richard Smith at the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service, who is always really insightful whenever I talk about any of the research work that I've done, and I've learned an awful lot from him too, and some of the ideas in the research came from him as well. And of course the British Academy, who funded me to be able to do this for a year, and University of Sheffield, who let me do this and not do my lectures, which is what I normally do. And so in terms of future projects or kind of ways to get involved, so there's a few things. If you want to find out more information about this, there's quite a lot of sites. So one thing I want to talk about is an event that I'm organising with Johnny Drury, who some of you may or may not know. We're going to do something quite experimental, I think, where it's Johnny's idea to put on something called a BOEM dialogue, which I hadn't heard of it until Johnny introduced me to it, but it overlaps a little bit with mindfulness in a way, and the idea is to try and kind of get a network of people, specifically in this case for the first one, professionals working in autism, just to really have a really open, non-judgmental conversation, which will be facilitated by Johnny. So there's a poster I'll put up to that in a second, and if you're a professional or a student working in the area of autism and would like to come along, then that would be great. Just send me emails and I can let you know about that. Also, there's lots of details on our research group webpage And I have a web page specifically about this project, which is 1in68.net. I'm sorry, it sounds like a gambling site. Someone said that sounds like a gambling site. But 1in68 is supposed to represent the estimation from the States that 1in68 people has autism. Also, the YouTube channel that I mentioned, this talk will be put on there, and you can see lots of previous talks that have been done, not by me, and the little video I was telling you about as well. Autism Hour, if you think that the place where you work might be able to get involved with Autism Hour, then have a look online. I think it's a really good idea for awareness raising. There's always Twitter, of course, ongoing research, and if you have any questions about this or anything that I've talked about, there's my email address, and I'm very happy for people to contact me by email.